what you see in front of you here. I was supposed to do more about validity, but given all the slides that I wanted to share with you, it became impossible to do justice to both aspects of the talk, so it will be more on issues of task as a construct than validity and validation, but you may disagree once you see the slides, so we'll see. When we talk about assessment, the fundamental concept is inference. If we do anything in assessment, is gather evidence to support the inferences that we are making about the abilities we're measuring. We deal with scores. And for many people, this is what the validity would start to look like. This is the latest model we're working with. It's Keynes 2006, 2013. And validity for psychometricians start right here. For language testers, we work right here. And all of those are nothing but a chain of inferences, an inference to the degree to which the scores represent somebody's behavior, the extent to which these scores are generalizable to the sample domain, the domain, and so on and so forth. So there are inferences, it's a chain of inferences that we are dealing with. And so when we're dealing with performance assessment and scores based on performance, we know that scores are influenced by the abilities we're interested in measuring, as well as the method that is used to elicit that behavior. And I may be using archaic language when I say elicit and so on, but bear with me. As well as perhaps the raters involved in providing the evaluations and the scores. And when we're talking about validity, as I said, it's about finding the evidence, theoretical arguments, empirical evidence that we marshal in order to support the plausibility of the inferences that are part of the equation. It's interesting to me here, again, this is psychometric work, but it is very much representative of language testing at large. Look at context, where it is, and look at trait, where it is. There is a separation between context and trait, which is endemic of our practices, and I think this would be in violation of everything that you all believe in this room. But that's the lay of the land. So it's just so you know where I'm coming from. I'm not an IA, I'm not a CA. I am a language testing person who has spent her life working on developing operational tests, such as the Minnesota Language Proficiency Assessment Battery. This is a standardized instrument used still in Minnesota. I was working on it, as you can see, the years. And it's 4 modalities: performance-based, French, German, Spanish. And I have published in the area of foreign language testing as well. I also work with English as a second language. I have worked with the TOEFL exam, for example, was chair of the committee of examiners that develops the research agenda as well as oversees the specifications for the instrument. I'm working with the British Council right now on the APTIS testing system. Oops. I worked also with English language learners in the schools and was the lead developer of instruments pre-K all the way to grade 12 for measuring academic English language proficiency in the schools as part of No Child Left Behind accountability testing in the US. This is all to say that I have worked in a variety of environments, and it is interesting when you do work like that, you start to see that no single model will work for all of these different contexts. And so it was out of a frustration with, I look at the theoretical world and I see a predominant model, and then I go to develop my specifications and domain of testing, and I see I can't rely on that model. Lots of problems. It does not address the specificities that I need to attend to in order to get at the behaviors and provide the types of scores that yield interpretations about the behaviors of interest. So I've had to develop things ad hoc, the way you are developing the IA syllabus, as per my survey of the literature and survey of the lay of the land that I'm interested in generalizing scores to. Oops. My work is quantitative, not largely, almost exclusively. So I don't come from a qualitative research background. I come from a quantitative research background. And my current employment is in a department of educational research. My department teaches the quantitative research and the measurement courses. We're not applied linguistics. That was the CBT. I've worked with CBT, computer-based, computer adaptive testing, and I have published in that area, and same comments I've made about the variety of contexts that became apparent when I was working with CBT as well. My research has focused on a lot on performance-based assessment, and when you're working with performance-based assessment, the task becomes a unit of focus. And I saw a great deal of tension between concepts of authenticity of task and construct representation when you're working with performance-based assessment. And that led me to publications trying to problematize the issues I see with the dominant theories guiding testing practices, and given the conversations in this room that are guiding language instruction, language teaching, and learning. So I'm talking about tasks. And we see that the discussion of tasks is not new. It started basically around the time that we started to talk about communicative competence, proficiency movement, performance-based assessment, as well as task-based instruction/assessment. So when we talk about task-based assessment, instruction, the dominant discussion focused on how the tasks are important to the extent that they represent real-life situations. So RL is critical when we talk about instruction and assessment with tasks. They also emphasize the instructional tasks are a tool for communication rather than a device to get learners to focus on grammatical features. So it was a push away from teaching grammar that promoted the use of tasks. But many would argue that we're not going to throw grammar aside. Grammar, vocabulary, the discrete components are important, but they are not sufficient for meaningful communication. They need to be integrated with other features in order to accommodate realistic, genuine conversation. We also need to differentiate when talking about tasks between closed tasks and open tasks. The closed task could be things such as what you see perhaps with the college board exams when they introduce writing as part of their testing system. Well, the writing is so contrived that it looks like a task, but it behaves like straightforward multiple choice types of items. Are you trying to show me something?
No, sorry.
But it behaves like something very close. It does not provide for genuine communication. So it's important that we understand, just because it looks like a task doesn't necessarily mean it is a task in the instructional task mode, and we need to be cognizant of that, especially in testing, because we tend to favor closed tasks more than open tasks in order to provide scoring and evaluation. So when we talk about tasks, we're talking about tasks that have focus on meaning and genuine communication. There's a problem that we need to solve, and that task completion is important. And you see rubrics increasingly in testing that have, one of the criteria is the extent to which the task was achieved, was completed. Well, that was not the case before. So this is something that comes from the instructional task world. In addition to a focus on meaning, tasks supposedly help us promote learning. And these are some of the features that the literature talk about in terms of the promotion of learning through tasks. So, when it comes to testing, we say that we are interested in meaningfully assessing the second language construct, ability, performance, use, whatever you want to put there, and making inferences from the test scores or the observed behavior to somebody's ability or their success in accomplishing tasks. So you're going to see these again. This is my representation of task. This is representation of ability. This is the behavior that comes from an ability engaged in a task, and then these are the chain of inferences or the claims. Some people would say claims that we're making about somebody's performance as representation of ability while engaged in a particular task. In language testing, this would be a way in which the task is represented. It's right here, and this is the person, and this is the ability inside that person's head, is the way we talk about it, as if there is a box where the construct resides, and these are the resources within that box, and they get engaged through a language activity / task as the person is trying to approximate their performance in the domain of use in real life. What is interesting is this up here. This is the ability side, this is the use side, and these are the hallmark of testing. We are interested in generalization. We cannot expect the performance to only generalize to the testing situation. It's better generalize beyond the testing situation to like tasks, and often we want to generalize beyond the sample task to other tasks, not quite like the ones that we sampled even. So the extent to which we are focusing with our assessments on these abilities, we can generalize. The more we are about task achievement per se, right here, then we are less able to generalize and more able to speak about the performance of the student in that particular context. You see the dilemma? If you are interested in generalization, you better be working here. If you're interested in genuine real-life communication, you just gave up your generalization chips. You bought other chips, but they're not the generalization chips. You're playing a different game. And this is potential performance, and this is supposedly actual performance. We can problematize this and talk about it and spend an hour just talking about this, but just wanted to show you how we tend to talk about it in language testing. Task. It didn't quite exist in the measurement world or in the language testing world. What existed was the term test method, and test method has an ugly history. The term test method basically okay, I just said that. So the term test method is an old term, and it appears in the 50s in the measurement world when we talked about multi-trait, multi-method. And then that kind of approach was replicated by Bachman and Palmer in the 80s. And other investigations of test method, some of which were pioneered by Elana's work on reading and the oral proficiency interview and so on and so forth. So we have, in the language testing world, have worked with task. We just worked with it as test method. And it was in the mid-90s that Bachman and Palmer decided, and it's a footnote. I mean, it took me a long time to find that footnote to make the connection between test method and task, in which they said, you know, yeah, the test method is really the task, but we will increasingly be using the term task because that connects us with our colleagues in SLA, plus this is a more concrete way of representing the instrument than talking about it as a test method, which is more abstract and not as useful. So with the mid-90s, we started to use the word task more and test method less. So the test method, as I said, has a troubled history. We didn't want it. We do not want it. We're interested in that box, that construct that testers are trying to get at. And the test method is nothing but the filter that we're trying to, that gets us the information through which we get the information. We're not interested in it. But, see, I'm jumping ahead of myself. In the measurement world, we even have a nasty term for it. We call it construct irrelevant variance. It's construct irrelevant. It is construct irrelevant. Just think of what we do here. You're not interested in the task, but you're interested in the underlying ability, as if you can differentiate the abilities from the task, which is the first slide that I showed you. So what language testers have tried to do with this method is either kill it. If they can get rid of it, well, we can't, so they try to reduce it, to control it, or to account for it. So, did I move up or down? Where is the quote? Oh my gosh, I just lost the slide. How can that be? I had a beautiful graph here. I don't know what it is. So I show you a quote, for example, from the European tradition. It's from the book by Alderson, Clapham, and Wall, in which they talk about how ugly the test method is and we need to reduce it. Other people talk about, like Lyle Buckman, let us try and control it. And in my own research, I came from the same tradition. I said, well, we can't really control it. We cannot reduce it. Let's just account for it and say X% of our variance is due to test method. But I had a cool graph for that. When we talk about the tension between authenticity and ability and the construct, we're basically representing two traditions here. They're called the IA, or the interactional ability, which is not what you're necessarily talking about. This is in language testing, the work of anybody who is interested in the attributes inside the construct. We call it interactional ability, versus RL, which is real life, and those are the people who are interested in gathering tasks and having the students perform on those tasks, and the extent to which they are successful on those tasks. Those are approximations of their performance in real life. So, Bachman represents the interactional ability, and he says we are interested in tasks, in interactional ability. It's not like we are not. However, the task plays a different role for us than it does for people interested in the task in and of itself. For us, the starting point is about the ability, and then the task is there to interact with that ability and make it manifest. And this is what he is talking about. So if you look up here, you see this is the score, and the score is divided into information about the construct and information about the domain of generalization. And if you look down here, attributes of the test taker, so this is the construct, the abilities inside the person, and these are the tasks that I am engaging the test taker with. And in terms of the inferences, we talk about authenticity, the degree to which these tasks approximate those up here. And if we're interested in the construct, I don't go to the tasks directly. I go to the test taker's interaction with that, but it is the abilities here that allow me to speak about somebody's construct. There's a bifurcation of evidence and representation. I'm going to move quickly. The standards, frameworks, benchmarks that we see in the foreign language world come almost exclusively from the real life approach and speak very little about the abilities. Here is a quote from the 2012 ACTFL guidelines. they say that the guidelines were revised to reflect real-world assessment needs. Real world is at the heart of the proficiency movement, the CFR, all of them. They're interested in tasks, the extent to which they approximate real life. In my own research, and this was back in the mid-90s, I was interested in the task, but I wanted to see the extent to which tasks could be approximation or generalization of one another. And the research that I've done showed that tasks stand as independent entities and they embody certain interactions that cannot be used to substitute for one another. So different dimensions or abilities underlie performance on different tasks. Some of those dimensions are stable across tasks. You see them in the same magnitude, same complexity, same everything, and others are variable across tasks. So we typically wear two hats. We wear the hat of the practitioner, and we wear the hat of the researcher. As practitioners, as a language tester, I am interested directly in evidence that speaks to the traditional reliability validity, and I engage in that kind of work on a daily basis. However, I also need to put on my researcher hat and begin to ask questions that help move us in a direction perhaps away from what we do on a daily basis in order to achieve more realistic practices given what the research findings are telling us. So it was out of that researcher hat that I was wearing. In 2003, I published an article in language testing, and I was asked to, in that article, to think about where the profession is going in the next 20 years. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary. And it was then that I started to look at the variety of disciplines from educational psychology to SLA and so on, and saw that we are truly behind in language testing in terms of representing the instructional task world. And I suggested that we move away from generic cognitive theories to talk about ability in language user in context, which means the construct and the task are interacting together and cannot be separated as we have traditionally done for decades. So current practices in language testing have been based on a cognitive paradigm. Even when you see somebody in here who is not a cognitive researcher per se, the way their findings were interpreted in practice have been very much cognitive in orientation. So we live in a cognitive tradition, and we continue to operate in that cognitive tradition. So when researchers such as Carol Chappell is engaged in operational work, she was one of the architects working on the validation of the new TOEFL, IBT TOEFL. So this is what she said. We surveyed the literature and we saw diverse perspectives on the nature of language proficiency, and we don't have a formal or strong theory of language proficiency, so we cannot rely on theory to tell us what to do with test specifications. So what does she do? She joins, and these are her words, competency-centered theories with task-centered assessment in order to create the specifications for TOEFL. And it looks like this. There is a bifurcation between the construct and the task. But the claims we're making about behavior, there's one claim that combines both. It's like, why bifurcate them here if you know ultimately it has to be a single claim? And we'll see this picture again later. And this looks like what I was showing you before. There's the bifurcation. Okay? And you see how they did here, there are these circles, and here it's one circle, but there's a corner for the construct, a corner for the task generalization. Similar to what you're doing here. And Chappell's perspective, Lyle's perspective, is very much in line with the tradition of measurement. So Messick is God in validity. Messick believed that when we're talking about context, it is just necessary to take context in consideration in terms of generalization, but it's not about the construct. Whereas Cronbach believed very much that generalization is about the construct. So did not believe in the bifurcation, believed that the two, construct and task, interact with one another. This is another way to look at that differential representation. Right here, we have the generic cognitive approach. This is the context. The individuals interact with the context or with the task. And we expect the behavior to be similar across individuals if they have the same proficiency level. We do not expect that in the differential conceptualization. The person interacts with the task and yields different behavior. This is what I suggested in an article that I wrote for a volume in educational measurement on validity, taking a sociocognitive approach, and you may not call it sociocognitive, whatever we want to call it, but it's more of a social paradigm than it is a cognitive paradigm. And I argue that this ACTFL guidelines operate within this paradigm right here. They view the person to be separate from the task. Even at the time of the analysis, there are person abilities and task abilities. They are separate, even though we talk about a person achieved X. We're not elaborating the features in relation to one another. This is the paradigm that Kel Chappell, Lyle Bachman operate with. Look at this. These are separate, but there is that relationship kind of highlighted between them. And they really come together only at the point of the analysis that they bring them together. I'm arguing that the social perspective is right here. It's the reciprocal transactional. And this is where the person and the task exist in relation to one another. They're constantly interacting and influencing one another. It's the same in terms of how we conceptualize it and how we analyze it. Whereas here, this is more like the language we observe with pilots. Their language, their English is so specific to air traffic control. You never hear it outside air traffic situations. So the person and the task, the construct and the task in a sense, they're always together, one and the same, and that you cannot differentiate them at all from one another. This might be an extreme, even for language for specific purposes. I think we operate more here than here. Again, this is the what I showed you earlier, the difference between the interactional ability and real life. And this is what those look like in terms of the graph that I shared with you. I'm not going to spend more time on this. So the difference between the cognitive and what I'm calling the sociocognitive is this. This is the cognitive right here. And when we're looking at what do the task attributes look like, Lyle Bachman presents us with a checklist called the Target Language Use Domain Checklist, which allows us to provide minute analysis of task features. And those are analyzed in terms of the situation in which they exist and the discourse features. Even at the eternal level, so the argument in language testing is perhaps when you are learning, the learning mode is sociocognitive. But once somebody has learned something, they own it. It becomes cognitive. So they differentiate between the external sociocognitive, but the construct itself, when I'm measuring it, it is cognitive, I own it. In a sociocognitive reciprocal approach, the argument is outside. I'm not looking to account like an accountant for the features, check, you have X of this, X of that. It is the construction of moment by moment of interaction, which you all do in this room beautifully. It was just such a thrill to see the examples you're all providing. But also at the internal level, the argument is we have contextual frames, to borrow language from educational psychology. The processes inside exist in relation to the attributes in which they were acquired and in which they will be manifested again. So this is current testing practices right there. We focused on, and Numa used some of the same language even though we have not talked. So there is an emic representation for the construct, and the goal is this, well, you'll see it later on as etic. And the goal here is generalization. So this is flipped. This title should be here, and this title should be there. I'm throwing myself off. It's like, oh, what's wrong here? Okay, this is not the last draft, obviously. So this is current testing practices. We aim to generalize. Abilities are static and fixed. We're looking at overall performance. It's a cognitive orientation, and we provide individual scores. With the revisioning, with a socio-cognitive perspective, it is an emic orientation, not generalization. It's specific. The interaction is fluid. I'm focusing on the moment-by-moment communication, external, internal, socio-cognitive. I don't provide necessarily individual scores. I provide scores given the co-construction that I have observed. Yeah, I'm just going to move forward here. So Buckley provides a checklist, so do other researchers in the field as well, but all those checklists are a beam counting approach to attributes. So moving forward, this is what we saw from Chappell. This is what I think we need to be looking at. Character ability in language user in context. This is one entity, one unit of analysis, and the claim is multiple claims based on the interaction of those two that are always working together. This is the representation for the construct when it's being analyzed, and the behavior, and then I am able to generalize about ability. For me, it is important that we don't stop here. The behavior is not just a representation of task accomplishment. I need to be able to account for the abilities that are underlying that behavior. And especially as teachers, this is important for you. You don't want to just know what tasks are they able to do. What is it that is driving their performance on that task? So it is the interaction of ability as perceived of person by task interaction. That's probably, I probably need to modify that so that it looks more like that up here. Okay. So these are some of the things that we need to rethink in testing. Variability of performance is not error. We look for stability of performance, and that's Cronbach's alphas. Reliability is about stability of performance. And anything that is not about stability is considered error. We need to start looking at variability. If we can account for it as per the interaction with the task, that's explainable. That's no longer error. That is person by task interaction. We need to rethink the conceptualization of ability as a generic attribute, but it is about task interaction. The term in the measurement world is task specificity, but it's always looked upon as if it's a dirty word. Task specificity is not dirty. It is real life. It is what you all do. It is the interaction of ability with a specific task. I argue for localized theory, localized context, and we need, even though we may look like we are sacrificing generalizability, but what we are gaining is a more accurate representation of what the construct looks like when it is in interaction mode, not that it exists in any other way, I think. So this is the name of a theory or approach to label the paradigm. It's ability in language user in context, and when Lila and I taught, He says, I agree with you, I just disagree about this right here, one small thing. Can I say ability in language user and language user in context? So he just changed that little hyphen right there. But that hyphen indicates that this is one unit. What he did by saying the and is he split it again into 2 units. I think we need to elaborate the characteristics unique to context, that is person by task in specific tasks. We need to understand what is driving performance with those interactions. So the challenges facing us today are different, and unless we collaborate, I don't think any discipline alone can address those challenges. We speak different languages, we have different interests, we attend to different things. It is through interacting with different disciplines that we can change the Goliath of cognitively based approach to instruction and testing. These are the things that I think are happening here. So cognitive approach, you can read them, it's ETIC, generic, a priori theory development, generalized performance, stable construct, individual representation of scores. The method is a dirty word. With the socio-interactional, it is emic representation, local, there is theory that comes a posteriori. Socio-cognitive, external and internal, localized performance, variables are meaningful and co-constructed by participants, and the tasks are integral to the structure of interaction. I'm going to move forward. This is, I think, if we're going to develop checklists, like Lyle and others have done, we operate in the world of checklists, whether these would be used to develop the test specifications or to develop the rubrics for analysis. I think these are categories that we need to attend to. And for us to understand this, we contrast it with how things are done right now. So we look at context and task as an accounting process. We look at resources L1 versus L2. Oh, where are you? Je le trouve pas. Okay, L2. We look at ability from low ability to high ability. Test purpose drives the interpretation and use, whereas what I'm suggesting is this. And I think together we can do a lot with this. Instead of talking about high ability, low ability, I think this might be irrelevant, especially in interactive ability, right? Competence. I have trouble with that word competence. It just harkens back to cognitive when we are trying to say we are not cognitive. So that's why every time it's like, it can't be. It cannot be interactive competence, please. So I think we also need to talk about it in terms of interactions between native speaker, and non-native speaker, non-native speaker, and native speaker. All of those interactions, I haven't heard much discussion of that, but this is the reality of the world that we live in, especially in English. We need to talk about not L1 versus L2 resources, L1, L2, and multilingual resources. Increasingly, the world lives there. We need to talk about intended interpretations and uses, and the test purpose is here, but we need to start bringing the intended users and the stakeholders into the conversation at the design level. And this is not stable. How did I have it here? Give me a second. Oops. So we talk about stable linguistic resources or interactional resources versus variable, and there are error, to talking about them as stable interactional resources and variable. This is rich, variable interactional resources. What resources are stable from one interaction to another? Not everything is variable, I would argue. Some things transfer and are there irrespective of what you do with them. Which ones are stable and which ones are variable is what we need to account for, I argue. So, generic testing, localized testing, beginning to stable construct, moves to stable features are not sufficient They exist, but they are not sufficient. Variability of performance as error. Expect different, you may use different words, linguistic, functional, creative components across tasks. You may use different words to talk about those dimensions, but that expect to find differential interactions. The tasks are described as a checklist. Here the checklist is contextualization cues. It is reciprocal structures of interaction. We give individual scores versus we need to shake that paradigm and allow, and we can do that very easily in the classroom. We can provide group-based scores based on co-construction. Generic theories versus local theories. And the task. The task is not something that comes as an afterthought. Not all tasks do the same thing. That's the whole point. And so a lot of thought needs to be given to the meaning, the appropriateness, the adequacy of the task chosen for the kinds of things we're interested in. In large-scale standardized testing, which is where I live most of my time, we also shoot for vanilla types of items or tasks. We strip them of anything that makes them, somebody used that in the classroom, the more controversial the better. Somebody said that today or yesterday. Because the more things are in the task, the more they engage of the resources of the test taker. Well, we strip them of all of that. We have sensitivity review committees that strip them so that they are emotionally comfortable when the test taker is engaged in them. Well, by the time we strip them of all of that, they tell us nothing. So we need to engage in tasks the way they do exist in real life. In terms of the classroom, I mean, I didn't have that slide until I came here. And you asked me the question, any of this apply to the classroom? All of them apply to the classroom. I think if change were to happen, it will not happen in a standardized testing unless perhaps you are at Rice University. You all are so powerful, you make things happen. But I think we can easily make that happen in the classroom. We can begin by what we call, if you will, informal assessment, assessment for learning, and embed those types of new tasks and assessment tasks in our syllabi and take it from there. Do I have more? Oh, I don't work only in, today I just focused on the construct. I've been arguing for these thoughts in validity at large. For example, communication with policymakers. This is something part of the co-construction argument. This is where I talk about consequences as being not the responsibility of the test user, and this is a huge argument in measurement, but that it needs to be negotiated. And I'm going to stop. Let's collaborate. Oops. Oops. Any bombs?